I'm Roxanne Reddington-Wild. I'm actually the secretary of the Partnership of Historic Bostons, which means I get to take lots of minutes and stuff like that. Um, and I'm also really fascinated by tonight's topic. Joe Palumbo will be talking on signs, stories, and unraveling myths. First, let me though tell you a little bit about the Partnership of Historic Bostons. We're a 17th century history organization. We're an all-volunteer organization. Our lifeblood is actually your donations. It's what keeps us going. We started out, gosh, over 25 years ago, um, as the name says, Partnership of the Historic Bostons, plural. We started out with people here in the area of Boston, Massachusetts, in the New World, and also making contacts with Boston, England, across the Atlantic in the Old World. So we started out very much as a partnership, trying to bridge that history and bring recognition about early 17th century New England and its links back to England. But we've really grown, we've blossomed and expanded over the years to really become, and I don't think I'm completely bragging here, the premier 17th century history organization for New England. Our focus now is not just the connection between the two Bostons, but New England history, 17th century history as a whole. And for us, it's the long 17th century. Really, in many ways, for us, it goes up to more or less just before the American Revolution. And indeed, we'll be looking at the revolution that led to the revolution is one of our themes for this spring. Today's event is Joe Palumbo, and he'll be speaking on Concord, Massachusetts. And indeed, Joe, you grew up in Concord. So let me introduce Joe. He was born and raised in Concord. He's actually from a farm here we get that revolutionary history that everybody thinks on, along the famed Battle Road of 1776 and all that, and earlier. He's completely steeped in the traditional history of Concord, Massachusetts, but what he tries to do is expand outside of that, in some ways, rather mono-focused traditional history. He earned his BA in history, no surprise, from Boston University, and then actually went on to California State University to get a master's in educational leadership. And with new research and with his greater understanding of past events, Joe actually, what he does now is he really works to open new windows and new opportunities so that we can all explore the past and we can tell fuller stories of all the people who built our nation and who fought for the expansion of freedom and equality, because he believes that there's more to our historical story than's often told. Currently, and I'm deeply jealous about his job, he works as an historical interpreter in the Boston area, which I would love to do. And he also serves as the co-president of the Robbins House Museum in, no surprise, Concord. So with that, Joe, thanks really a heck of a lot for being willing to share your knowledge and your approach to history with us tonight, and how we really can go beyond the traditional stories and signs that we all sort of receive passively from our environment around us. Let's go and actually first let me say the structure of tonight's evening, and then we'll go over to you. So Joe obviously is going to be talking probably till about 55 minutes or so, till around about 8 o'clock, folks. And then we will expand the conversation to your questions and Joe's ideas and thoughts and answers. As Joe is talking, do please make use of the webinar chat and the Q&A to ask questions that you would like Joe to address during what will probably be about 20 minutes or so of questions and discussion. And then we'll close with going back to Joe for like final thoughts that you have, Joe, message that you really want to get out to us. And then I'll let people know about our upcoming events and how you can donate, because as I said, it's the lifeblood of our organization. And frankly, how you can become active, I hope, with the partnership, because we'd love to have you involved with us. But let's go now over to Joe and your presentation.
Well, thank you, Roxanne, and thank you, Historic Boston, for even asking to learn more about this, because I have, in the last few years, the work that Historic Boston's done and the seminars you provide is always such a good resource for so many of us, especially public interpreters, um, to get this good content in new and different ways and help us tell new and different stories. And although, Roxanne, that was very lovely what you had to say, this is really the work of many people in our community that are trying to advance this story. And I hope that tonight I just can tell you a little bit about what we're doing, but know that it's by no means my work alone. It's a lot of people's time and effort uh, to really think about these side stories and these myths that we're trying to unravel. I also want to thank Sarah, who just sort of noticed what we're doing and said, "Do you want to talk about this?" And I know that you know, focus specifically on 16th, 17th century. And I guarantee you, we're going to talk about the 16th and 17th century. We're going to end up in the 19th, 20th, and 21st. So hopefully, we won't pull the plug somewhere as we end up in the modern world. Um, I think just a little bit about how we're going to approach this topic this evening. We're going to first, I'm going to try to really tell stories about how we've interacted with signs, stories, and myths in our community, and really talk about the content of we've dealt with. And then at the very end, we'll discuss a little bit about process, because my guess is all of you in your own communities are working at this in different ways. And I hope that in some ways that tonight's discussion is instructive and gives you some tools and tips and strategies that you can try out, and or certainly ask about at the end, because frankly, this work is just built on what other communities have been doing. We've learned so much from advice we've gotten from other towns and other cities that either we've talked to, we've read about. We're trying to do this same important work in the 21st century. So with that being said, let's just go ahead. And I'm into a lot of visuals. A lot of these signs aren't necessarily signs in the traditional sense, roadside signs or building signs. They're just signals you get. And this is for many of you who are, history nerds like myself are, this is a tea towel. And these people have in their bathroom. I think it was in a public space in our town. We wipe your hands down with you call it a word cloud, or there's different names for these things. This is what Concord was selling or is selling in a gift shop about who we're about. Um, and it struck me when I saw it, because I realized when you look at that and the words and the things that are mentioned, there's not one single mention of any of the indigenous history of Concord or the indigenous residents of Concord. There's certainly no mention of the African American history of Concord, the Black citizens who helped build our town, or the immigrants who came. And I just remember when I looked at this, I thought, gosh, that is the Concord that I was taught about. Because I grew up here, and when you grew up in a historic town, when you're a little kid, they just pound this history into your head. And luckily, I was, I guess, a super nerdy kid. I just ate it all up because I loved it. We all at schools dragged you down to the Old North Bridge all the time. I worked at historic homes. I used to ride my bike, go to all of them. I was a tour guide at the Orchard House. I worked at the Wayside. I was a volunteer as a 12-year-old with little knickers, standing next to the tour guides. I was into this, and I really believed, and we all did, that there was just some of the magic about this place. And I remember thinking as like a young adult, like, wow, how did it happen that so many things happened here and didn't happen anywhere else? So I just want to say that I'm speaking from a perspective that I had and held my whole life. I remember when you'd bring visitors from California, they'd come to Concord for the first time, friends, and they'd be like, "Oh, it looks like Disneyland." I was asking myself, "No, no, 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 no. Disneyland looks like this place." But then I realized it was that sort of the mythology that had been perpetuated. So I'd like to start with thinking about these four myths that we're going to talk about tonight, because okay, what are the central myths that I think we were teaching in Concord, or certainly that I was exposed to in Concord, that we're now starting to look at in different ways? The first one we're going to talk about tonight is I call the founding of Concord at the Sacred Tree. For any of you who've read Firsting and Lasting by Gene O'Brien, Concord fits into that pattern quite beautifully. That there was this magical moment where the town was founded. We'll talk about that. Certainly being brought up, I was taught to believe that just these free people fought and literally birthed the nation here on April 19th, 1775. We'll talk about how the myth that there were these literary giants that lived here and they alone led the cause for the abolition of enslavement. And then in the 20th century, by some luck, the Concord was blissfully unchanged by modernity in the 20th century, and we wisely preserved this most esteemed place forever. These are sort of the myths that I grew up with, and many Concordians grew up with, as how we think about the town. But what I've learned and we've started to figure out as a community is when you start unraveling these myths, you find there's so much more to it, and there's so much more additive and interesting pieces. So let's start in the 16th century. I like to call, you guys have all seen this before, I always call this the invasion map. This is, the first time New England was slapped on a map, and, encouraging the Puritan migration. Folks, come on over. Yeah, we're this land that is really the land of the indigenous who've lived here for tens of thousands of years. We're just, we want to find a place, and we're promoting it heavily. And I love this little promotional thing, which you may have not seen. It's from a book that was used to convince people to jump on the migration train of what's been planted. The settlements have been planted in New England as of 1634. And where the red arrow is, what I love about that is it's the indigenous place name of what will one day be changed to Concord is there, Musketaquid. And Musketaquid River, Musketaquid, the Algonquin translation is roughly land between the grassy rivers. It's just so clear. I mean, we know all the places. We know Plymouth had its name change. We know Shawmut became Boston. We know Namkeg became Salem. But I love this because it reminds us that even the English, as they were promoting people to come and fill this place up, they knew that this was indigenous land, and they knew this place was called Musketaquid. So we were taught in Concord that magically somehow it changed from Musketaquid to Concord, and it all settles down by the 20th century, I call this the founding at the Magic Tree. If you've read Gene O'Brien's Firsting and Lasting, if you haven't, you should really take a look at it. We're almost like a case study for what she talks about in this book of how we've created these stories that were perpetuated in the early 1800s of the good founding. To make a long story short, in front of this imaginary tree stood this ancient oak beneath which Major Simon Willard and his associates bought from the Indians 6 miles of land square, et cetera, et cetera. And this fits the pattern that Gene talks about in the early 1800s. Many New England towns wanted to distance themselves from the horrors of the Cherokee removal and went back and reconstructed the stories of the myths about how we did it the right way. We know there's no paperwork evidence of any of this happening. We know that there was really no treaty at all. There was maybe a land use agreement, and certainly in the late 1680s, when the English government was looking for paperwork, the people in Concord reconstructed through memory what had happened and created an affidavit. But there's stories where it happened under a tree, it happened in front of a minister's house, but it's clear this is a constructed narrative. But by the 20th century, it wasn't taught to us that way. It was taught to us was fact. And what's so interesting about it is Concord, the name of the town means the word Concord is roughly a peaceful agreement. The actual, what little older history we have, they talk about it as a peaceful agreement of the 12 English families. But by the 20th century, we had created that it was the peaceful agreement of the indigenous wise elders and the wise minister and et cetera, who came together and formed this town. So we were even taught as children that that's where Concord came from because it was the peaceful agreement. Well, we know that's not true, but the question was, This sign is posted in our town, and you've probably seen these tercentenary signs. They're all over the state. Um, this was sort of the first trigger because the Okiteo Cultural Center, Nipmuc Cultural Center out in Grafton, did a wonderful series in 2020, a video series, one specifically on these monuments and these signs that were all throughout the state. And one of the indigenous leaders talks about how for him, they're often visual terrorism. And when some of us heard that, we thought, wait a minute, we've got three of these in our town. Are they telling the truth? What are they saying? So I want to take you a little back about, well, this Jethro tree itself. Before we decided to have the conversation, we had to do some unpacking about where it came from. So this magic spot under this magic, beautiful tree, here's what that space looked like about 1870. In 1870, there's no tree. There's no sign, of course. It's a dilapidated hotel that had been there for 40 or 50 years that needs to be taken down. It's a fire hazard and gets destroyed and taken down. But no one's worried about the Jethro myth because that's not part of the town narrative yet. In fact, a few years later, you can see here's the tavern in the center of town. You see where the red is. The hotel's long gone, and it's not like somebody has put up a Jethro tree sign or there's no Jethro tree there because it's not in people's consciousness yet. So the question is, where did that come from? How did that get in the consciousness? I don't know, but here's some of the things we started to look at. About I think 1880, 1883, Concord was doing a celebration, and they started putting these huge granite boulders in different parts of town to articulate key moments in history. And again, Jean talks about this a lot in First and Lasting. She uses Concord as quite an example in here. This is a rock that was put out on the river. Sorry about the 1890 language. There was a huge river culture in those days. Everyone was out paddling on the weekends. So this was going to be in a very prominent spot where the two rivers came together. And it talks about on this hill at the meeting place of the rivers along the bank, the lived, past tense, the Indian owners of Musketaquid before the white man came. So it's sort of like a setting it down that this is something that happened in the past, which Jean talks a lot about. And I love, this is from the speech that was given the day the rock was set. These simple words inscribed on the rugged face of the rock where the rivers meet will serve to remind us and succeeding generations of a people who have vanished from the face of the earth, leaving scarcely a trace of themselves except for a few arrowheads and stone pestles here and there and mound of heap of clamshells. So we understand that in the context of 1890s, Concord, that was sort of a ending, like this is over, this is the past, even though we now know, right, Indigenous residents are over 15,000 members of our state. We have this rock out there starting the story. Well, we weren't going to start by taking out this rock. I can't even imagine how we're going to do that, but it helped us think more about the sign. Maybe this is where some of that narrative was coming from. Then we came across this map from 1928. And this was the people going out in cars for the first time, road travel. And it's a very beautiful, artistically illustrated map with a lot of very difficult imagery on it. Just to point out, right here, right here we have sort of their main image. And there's a whole bunch of offense in there, and as you can see, but it sort of starts to reinforce this past tense of the gifting of the Musketaquid had happened, from the red caricature of an indigenous person to there's a lot that to unpack there, right? So that's like, oh, okay, we're in this time period, late 20s now. This is getting to the town narrative. And this next slide, a little blow up, where you see the rock in the center, where it says Egg Rock. That's where that monument that we were just talking about is. And you see how here once was the home of the original owners of Musketaquid, and someone's drawn some rather both inaccurate and offensive little teepees. But this is 1928, right? Still, though, no mention of Jethro's tree. If you look in the bottom right of the map, you'll see in the center of town, right taverns listed. There's nothing about Jethro. There's nothing about the tree because it's not a monument yet. Until here's a 1930. This is in the town parade. someone's doing a float about the founding of Concord, 1635. You can kind of see some mm, pilgrim dress up and some native dress up. Maybe they're reenacting the tree. So maybe that's getting more into the consciousness, perhaps. And this picture, this is from the 40s. And that's actually my dad at home on leave, I believe, some in the middle of World War II. But if you look where the red arrow is, you see the Jethro's Tree sign for the first time. It's close to the road, it's facing the road because that's about wanting street traffic to see it, because that's how these were put in across the state. And you can see there's no real tree behind it. In fact, there's a town bulletin board, which is kind of how that space was used. So again, it's now, okay, it's arrived, it's here. Um, what's going on in Concord in the 20s and 30s? How are we thinking about Indigenous people in the 20s and 30s? And in this work, we came across this image, which is a little troubling. Just a little warning before we look at it. This is a minstrel show happening in the center of town in 1925, I believe. And there's a couple of levels to look at on this photo. First, obviously, the participants in blackface in the first row. But if you look in the back row, you see a pilgrim and then you see several people in red face. So this tells us a few things. 1928, yes. 1925, yes. But also this was in a book published by the town of Concord through the Town Historical Society in 1985. And it wasn't just any old picture in the books. There's only one picture in the entire book that's on the center spine. It's the only double image in the entire book, and this is it. Not because people in 1985 were bad people, but the fact that they didn't even think this was a pleasant, like, isn't it the old times, weren't the old times great? So this is kind of how I had just seeped into our town. And the third level of this book was sold in our visitor center until like a year ago. So as what I hope you're seeing as the layers of how this just became how we talked about these things. So with that all in mind, we decided, people said, well, that's 1920s. Really? Can we not? I mean, we can't go back in time. And then we came across this one. This is a brochure that was really quite popular with a lot of folks in town. It was published in the late 90s, funded by Welch's, and it has all sorts of images in it. This one is their description of Metacom's war. Of course, here, the English educated Wampanoag chief led an uprising, right? And then this image, this again is a beautiful watercolor painting of exactly what Gene O'Brien talks about. Here we have Jethro's Tree repainted again for us of the moment of transfer. So you see these things are just, they're so seeped in that they're almost difficult to even notice anymore and remove. And then in looking in that brochure, we came across this too, how even in the turn of the early 2000s, how we were talking about, finally, there was a local band, a tribe of Algonquin Indians. The first summer, a treaty was struck with them under the great oak tree. Unfortunately, the Indians did not seem to understand they had sold the land. I mean, it goes on. And when I was working on this, I realized I hadn't even noticed there's this quote on the left-hand column that talks about that he'd found a little bit of England over here. I mean, so this just keeps reinforcing how this dropped into our narrative, so it became what we believed. By the time we had pulled this all together, we realized there were three of these signs in the community. The first, the Jethro's Tree sign we talked about, there's one that was nearby on the mill dam that described a fishing weir that we have no archaeological evidence that it ever existed. And the very heinous first settlement signs, which I know the folks at the Ocotillo Cultural Center talk about a great deal, the concept that there was nobody here. So we went around the state planting every time a first European showed up, which is also in the First and Lasting book. So we knew we had the problem with these three. How do we do something about it? It was a long process. It took over a year. I didn't really know how to start. I got some advice from folks and say, hey, go to the Historic Commission. We started with them. They thought about it and they started doing work on it and study and research on it. The year went on. We hadn't made a lot of progress. There was a lot of thinking about it. We hadn't really done anything. And by the fall of that year, 23, I don't know if the ancestors intervened. We don't know how this happened, but a mixed race, indigenous and African woman came into the visitor center and on her own lodged a complaint and said, I've seen these signs in your town. They're offensive to me. You should be doing something about it. That complaint worked its way up through town government. And then before you know it, this conversation was now before the select board of these signs are inappropriate. They say they aren't telling the truth and they're offensive to over 15,000 indigenous residents of the state. That conversation was difficult. Where we went right through the heart of the conversation about who we are as a town. Um, there were folks that tried to stop it from actually even coming up for discussion. It was on the agenda, it was taken off the agenda, we got to put back on. And after a lot of work with leadership of both select board and municipal government, those signs were removed. I think it was January of the year of January 24, someone just sent me the picture and said they're gone. And they're not destroyed. They weren't like burned and melted down. They're safely and hopefully will be interpreted properly in a museum someday. But they're not telling untruths anymore. And we felt like, wow, we've made some progress. Because when you look back here, these are the pictures that always bothered me. People innocently, just tourists taking photos of what was lying to them. So that was sort of the first piece that we did with this. And we get to questions, you can ask me more details, but I feel like we felt like something had been accomplished. We don't have, we have a lot of work to do about how we properly honor Indigenous history in Concord. We're not there at all. We've made very little progress since here as a community or as a town government. We have museums though, like the Concord Museum that's working hard on this. We have institutions like the Umbrella Arts who's really bringing these stories to town, but there's yet no formal relationship between the Nipmuc Tribal Council and the town of Concord. That's something that we want to work on, but it's not happened yet. It's unfortunate the two main sites we have of Indigenous history in the town. These are the two things we can find. There's this rock that somebody put in the 90s. I mean, you can read the text on it. I mean, I'm sure it was well-meaning, but super vague about these people. And then our big shell midden, which has mostly been destroyed by development, but the shelled midden itself is not, you can't access it. There's no description of it. It's just kind of like behind this fence. So let's just give you some sense of this first myth, what we've done and how far we have yet to go. Well, another myth that we've dealt with in the town from the very beginning is that free people fought and birthed the nation literally here in April 19, 1775. I love this picture. It's a Doolittle print. You probably have seen it. It's used very frequently in this town for almost every occasion you can imagine because it's like the seminal moment when the British march into town. I recently saw a man who's running for select board. Roughly, this image is like the homepage of someone's campaign because it just tells you how important it is to the town. And as a child, I was taught, and what we were taught, that it was really, yeah, there's stuff that happened in Boston leading up to April 19th, and there's stuff that happens after, but really the moment was April 19th at the Old North Bridge. I mean, we now know that was an important moment, but there was a lot more to it, but that's sort of not kind of how we thought about it. And certainly no one talked to us about the diversity of the participants in the American Revolution. This is another Doolittle image. We talk about the battle at the Old North Bridge. I mean, no one taught us in school that there were both freed and enslaved people in Boston and New England. And, you know, slavery was something that happened in the South, certainly not in Concord. But we know that almost every family of middle and upper wealth had more than one or more enslaved person in the home. And without getting into great detail, I think it's seminal when we look at the bridge, because in 2004, the National Park Service wrote a very large report on the analysis of the study of the constructions of the various bridges. And in 2004, they identified that the actual bridge that they fought on April 19th, 1775, was built in 1760. And, you know, people have receipts of who was paid. And we see that at least two people in the Billings family were paid for the construction of their service to the Old North Bridge by their enslaved persons. So that means there are enslaved hands that built the bridge that way people stood on the day the shot heard around the world happened. How wonderful that is. I think of it from an education perspective, from a storytelling perspective, from understanding the narratives about freedom and what freedom means. This is like seminal to being able to broaden the story of what happens on April 19th. But what's fascinating to me, it was buried in a report from 2004, and I don't, and until the last few years, I don't, people weren't talking about it, and we couldn't figure out why. We even had pushback with people saying, I heard someone's talking about slave people built the bridge. Like, yes, slavemen helped build the town itself. So with about a short amount of time we have, I want to take two particular members that really relate to this bridge, because not just the building of the bridge, we now are talking more clearly about patriots of color. We now know, thanks to the National Park and other researchers, right, there were over 20 to 40 so far identified men that fought on April 19th of color, indigenous, mixed race, African, both free and enslaved. What a crucial and wonderful part of the story to be telling, what kind of images we should be showing. Every time now, when I just show Minutemen, I just show this picture just so that people start to get in their heads that this is who we were. It's who we've always been. It was interesting when we first started this conversation. The very first committee meeting I went to, I had never been to like a public committee in town. And I mentioned this, and literally someone looked across the table to me and kind of tipped their hat and said, are we going to start talking about trans Minutemen next? And I was just shocked. I just couldn't believe that in 2022, that was the kind of reaction I got. We tried to get Patriots of Color spoken about at the Old North Bridge ceremony, and people were nice at first, and they basically, the message, well, could you just write it down on a piece of paper? Give me a few sentences and we'll say something. But we kept working at it, and for the 2 years in a row now, we've had words and names read of some of these Patriots of Color. And two I want to highlight are Caesar Robbins and Brister Freeman, both of these men, because they connect more deeply into our story. So these are both men who were enslaved at the time of April 19th, 1775. Talk about Caesar Robbins a little bit. Caesar Robbins, we believe he was at the Old North Bridge because at that time he was enslaved to a man in Acton, and that Acton company was on the bridge. We think it's highly likely that Caesar was brought that day with them. We don't have the evidence, but we're about 99% sure. But we do have evidence that later Caesar enrolled in the Continental Army, served both at Fort Ticonderoga and Dorchester Heights. We don't know how, but at some point by 1780, he was near the war's end. He was back on the rolls of the local rolls as a free man. And fascinatingly, the bridge needed to be rebuilt in 1788. So back to that 2004 report, they have the receipts of who got paid to build the bridge. And we see Caesar Robbins on that list for paid for a day and a half. And the difference is this time, even though we had enslaved people building the bridge before the revolution, we now have Caesar Robbins, a free man, getting the pay himself, not going to an enslaver in 1788. So again, this is a beautiful way of telling the story of the American Revolution and freedom in new ways by talking about this. We know Brister Freeman, same thing. He's now appearing for 7 days in pay. So we're trying to make these connections. The visual here is we call in Concord the Robbins House. It's really the only Black History museum in the Metro West area that is the home or property of a person of a patriot of color. Caesar Robbins ends up after the war having a small home and a plot of land on the edge of town. Eventually, this home is built. He passes before he's able to live in it, but his children will live there. And this is really the beginning of Concord's work at trying to retell the story. The group of pioneers in 2010, 2011 saved this house, bought it, and opened this museum. And they really were the start of this work that we're not only building upon now. So that's a little bit about Caesar Robbins. I'd like to talk also about Brister Freeman because he plays into the story. So Brister Freeman was enslaved to a man named John Cumming. John Cumming was one of the wealthiest landowners in town. He was called Squire Cumming. He served as town moderator many times. We have this picture of the desk because when Brister was about 8, he was given as a wedding present to John Cumming. And the other big present John Cumming got was a desk. So the Concord Museum has this desk in its collection and is doing an interesting job now at reinterpreting the desk through the eyes of Caesar, excuse me, through the eyes of Brister, who as a small boy may have very likely had to polish that desk. Uh, and it really helps people learn quickly about what are we talking about when we're talking about enslavement in Concord and power and control in Concord. The picture next to the desk is the John Cumming house, which amazingly still exists. Next time, if you ever have to deal with the Concord Rotary, it's right on the Concord Rotary. It's actually owned. It's a state police or MCI state police use it for different office purposes, but it is potentially could be quite an amazing historic spot, especially with the upcoming closure of MCI Concord. I have this vision, hope that someday this will become the Brister Freeman Freedom Center, and we'll have great interpretive programs there. But I digress. So how has Concord remembered Brister? Interestingly, this map on the left, this is from 1964, I believe. It's another one of those illustrated maps, and you see at least Brister's noted. But it's named Brister's Hill, named for Negro Brister Freeman. At least they mentioned his last name, mentioned by Thoreau in Walden. A lot of what we know about Brister is because he's mentioned by Thoreau. And if you look at the next pictures on the slide of a monument was placed by the Robbins House and collaborating with others in, I believe, 2011-ish or early 2010s, where we've located the site of Brister's home. Because after the American Revolution, he came back as a free man with another patriot of color. They purchased on the very edge of town near Walden Pond, a very simple place to try to eke out a living. That monument was placed there, and it's getting connected to Thoreau. It's sort of interesting to me how we still, when we started talking about Brister, we have to somehow link him back to Thoreau, almost as if we don't have enough for him to stand on his own. This sign below is another Thoreau connection. There's a street named after Brister's Hill Road. And as many of you know who are familiar with how towns have used the names of Black individuals, especially enslaved or formerly enslaved, if anything's named after them, it's often first name. So this is Brister's Hill. But unfortunately, some well-meaning people in the 90s and the Historic Commission tried to add these little signs around town. And because they were listening to Henry David Thoreau, who had the names wrong, we have Scipio Brister, slave, sorry about the language, freed before 1772, lived near here. That's not accurate. Scipio Brister is not Brister Freeman. Scipio Brister is a Black individual in Lincoln. So, we're trying, but we've got we're working on getting the sign down, hopefully before April 19th, because we're trying to do some honoring of Brister, and it would be nice not to have some other persons identified as him. There's another little interesting story that happened this year with Brister. John Cumming, his enslaver, had a large building at the hospital, Emerson Hospitals in Concord. We have an administrative building that was called the John Cumming Building since the 70s. Why was it called the John Cumming Building? Nobody at the hospital could quite figure out how it happened. Probably it was in the 70s during the bicentennial craze. Someone said, do we have a doctor that was served in the Revolution? And I think he was the go-to doctor. So they named John Cumming's building. But Emerson, to its credit, really thought about, like, in 2024, how do we want to be remembered? And they decided that that was not an appropriate name to have on their building. So it was changed to the Medical Office Building. And I could have been the Brister Freeman, or maybe Brister and his wife Fenda Freeman Building, but whatever. So it's the Medical Office Building. But look at the language that's used in the news article about it in the town paper. Emerson scrubs the 18th century doctor's name over in slavery ties. And then I like this first sentence: Emerson Hospital has stripped the name of a doctor, I don't know. And then the next paragraph, the hospital has quietly renamed. So that's how these conversations sometimes play out in our town. Like, are we losing history when what we're really thinking about is we're trying to be additive and add new stories? Sometimes I think people feel like when we're adding, we're taking away. Something we can discuss in the chat. One other thing I want to show you that really it's an example of a sign. about a myth that kind of strikes me. We're talking with a group of people about what's really important to us in our community. The left-hand picture we have extensive trail systems in Concord. There's trails all over. It's very beautiful for people who like walking on trails. And the town has invested a lot of money in these very beautiful kiosks that tell you where the trail is, here are the map, everything you need to know. They're covered, quite nice. And with interpretive signs next to it. There was nothing for Brister Freeman other than the rock. And so we had a young Boy Scout who, for one of his projects, wanted to put new interpretive markers throughout the town around Concord Black history. He'd been inspired as a middle school student to learn about Concord Black history. He wanted to add them in town. I think he had 6 to 10 he proposed. After years of work going through town process, historic commission, etc., he ended up with, they allowed him to do one. And he, on his own, had to make, and you can see the construction, he had to make it himself, install it himself, with the help of the Robbins House. And for the first time, Brister Freeman has an interpretive marker. But that's not because of town effort or town resources. That's because of the leadership of an individual person in the collective. So I guess I keep always thinking about, well, why don't we have beautiful kiosks like this around our Black history and our Indigenous history? What's stopping us from doing that? And my friends in town are tired when I show them this picture. There's a formerly Black neighborhood, Black and Indigenous neighborhood, that is currently our waste treatment plant. So if you want to go there, if you've looked, this is what it looks like. We're working on it. But it just kind of always strikes me like we had the money to get an organized turtle crossing sign, but we haven't figured out yet how to acknowledge our Black history. So this is a snippet about the second myth we're trying to unravel. The third myth we're trying to unravel, and this one I would get a real heavy hit when I was a child, that literary giants lived here and they led the cause for abolition of enslavement. These are the classic Concord homes, the Alcott house on the left, the Emerson house in the middle, Thoreau's cabin reproduction, he even gets a statue with it. The Old Manse where Hawthorne lived, the Wayside where Hawthorne lived in more than one place, obviously, as the Alcotts did too, and Emerson in the middle. I always call these the Concord Pantheon, because at least in the 20th century, this was the pantheon of the sort of godlike figures that lived here in the 19th century. We sort of jumped from the amazing birthing of the nation in 1775, and then we jumped to these literary giants who live here in the 19th century. And this statue in the middle is, it's called Seated Emerson. It was done by Daniel Chester French. It's in the Concord Public Library, and I always think of him as the Zeus sort of the Concord pantheon, wisely sitting. And what's interesting is, although they all did some awesome work, they all have very different perspectives on race, on abolition, on the rights of Indigenous and people of color. So we can't lump them together as a group of abolitionists who fought the fight. The people who fought the fight in Concord, who led the fight in Concord, was the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. This is just pictures of a few of them, but there was a group of women led by the woman in the middle, Mary Merritt Brooks, who pushed Concord to think about abolition. It was a mixed race group. Susan Garrison was in that group. Susan Garrison, remember we're talking about Caesar Robbins, the man at the bridge? Caesar Robbins' daughter is Susan Garrison in the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. On the right, that's a picture of Helen Thoreau, Henry David's sister. It was really the women of the Thoreau family, the sisters and the mother, that convinced or pushed Henry to become aware of this abolitionist work. So it's classic, like, wow, it was really the women of Concord that led the abolition work initially in Concord. And slowly the men came over, but that's not what we had been taught. And now we're working hard to elevate these stories. Mary Merritt Brooks, if you want to know more about them, if you've not read Sandra Petrolinas' book, To Set This World Right, it's every little detail you ever want to know about the women who ran this. And Mary Merritt Brooks is fascinating. She has these wonderful quotes about when the men were poo-pooing them. She says, I will be more than the men. The men always want us to stay home and stay home in men's stockings. We'll be happy to do that when the men take care of their business. So she's like that, just a pusher. It's a great, great read. But that's who made this stuff happen in Concord. All these famous Black leaders who started to connect with Concord Frederick Douglass speaks in Concord in 1841 when he's 23, 24. That's an amazing moment in Concord history. Frederick Douglass will come to Concord 3 times. Ralph Waldo Emerson didn't bring Frederick Douglass to Concord. The Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society and their allies did. Harriet Tubman will come to Concord 3 times. Sojourner Truth will be in Concord. The Crafts are here. They're connected to the Haydens here in Boston. That's because of the work of those women. And I think that's what a story that we're doing a much better job at telling. We're making some progress on that now. Um, I love this story. This is a home in Concord. We call it the Bigelow House. And the color picture, it's still there today, looks pretty clean. But if you know your Hayden history, right? One of the most famous moments in escape, returning a freedom seeker to freedom was the Shadrach Minkins being secreted out of Boston. Well, where does he come the night? He comes to the Bigelow House here in Concord, not Emerson's house, not Hawthorne's house. He comes to the Bigelow House because she's involved in the Female Anti-Slavery Society. Her and her husband and Mary Mary Brooks live across the street. They take care of Shadrach Minkins. Lewis Hayden comes out here, and then they get him off to Leominster the next morning. What's interesting, there is no indication of this house in town. There's no marker. There's nowhere. If you didn't have a tour guide taking you around, you would never know this existed. The folks who live there, they know more about it. Canadian television has come down to their house and done a documentary there because the folks in Montreal, where Shadrach Minkins ended up, want to know about him. But for some reason in Concord, we can't get a sign there yet. One of the signs that Boy Scout wanted to put in would have been at this spot, but we don't seem to be interested in it. What's interesting, though, is when he left Concord, Shadrach Minkins, the next place he was secured was in Leominster. And I love this picture because here's what they do in Leominster. Like, why was it? It's just so fascinating to me how one community embraces it and wants to acknowledge it, and another community, like, I guess we have other things to talk about, or it doesn't fit into the narrative. I'm not sure. The other moment that I think we've made some progress in, I'm talking about who the abolitionists really are. This is an image we used for a woman named Ellen Garrison. Let's go back. Caesar Robbins at the Old North Bridge. His daughter was Susan Garrison. Her daughter was Ellen Garrison. So this would have been Caesar Robbins' granddaughter. She grew up in Concord, went to Concord Public Schools. After graduation, she got hooked up with the abolitionist movement. She wanted to become a teacher in the freedmen schools in the South. This is a piece of paper. We like to call it a passport, but it's a piece of paper signed by a local judge so she could travel with some modicum of safety. Look at the year it's written. It's right, 1854. So right during the time of Fugitive Slave Act, she's carrying around this piece of paper to prove that she's a free woman, willing to leave the relative safety of her little town of Concord and goes into the South to teach. Later on, she'll teach in Kansas. She'll end up in California. She lives a whole life as a teacher, an educator, and a civil rights leader, all connected back to her grandfather, who was probably most likely at the Old North Bridge. This is the abolitionist story that we're trying to tell in Concord. We've made some progress in this area. And this last year, Concord was building a brand new middle school, had no name. It was just going to be the Concord Middle School. Every town and every other school had a name. So we thought, wow, this seemed logical. Let's name the school after Ellen Garrison, because she's now we've taught people about her as this abolitionist and freedom fighter and civil rights fighter. Actually, it was harder than we thought. You may have, if you paid attention to any Boston media, there was a lot of work last year done in Concord to try to get the school named after Ellen Garrison. We have a little map in the corner that shows we were trying to help people see, look at all the buildings we have named after white guys and one white woman. Couldn't we have like one, be the first building named after a person of color in 400 years of Concord history? We had a town meeting, folks were engaged. We had over 900 people come and vote to have her name added to that building. You got local news coverage because there was a little conflict with the school committee and how it would happen. And I just love this quote from one of the articles in the paper when we were trying to get the board to accept the will of the town. Please do not change your decision based on a small, loud group with no appreciation for law and order. It's just like classic, right? Always go to the law and order thing, right? This was fascinating to me that a conversation about school somehow got connected to law and order. Well, it all worked out pretty well, and compromise, the town ended up naming the building the Ellen Garrison Building at the Concord Middle School. So really for the first time, kids starting next month on February 24th will go to a building with her name on it. So I think for the next 50 years, every single kid that goes in that building is going to learn that the abolitionists in this town weren't just the literary figures, although they may have helped. They were led by the women and led by people of color that actually made this work happen in our town. And I just, oh, good, we're doing good on time. So I would just like to talk about this fourth myth. And this one is, it's been super challenging, especially in the 20th century. And it is that somehow, blissfully unchanged by modernity, in the 20th century, the Concord wisely preserved this most esteemed place forever. And I use this image because that's often this, we recall this bucolic image of Concord in the 1850s. And somehow, because our town center still sort of looks, some of the roads are in the same place, somewhere in the 20th century, we decided that we are magically preserving that. And I put in Thoreau's quote because it gets used a lot here. Henry David writes in 1856, "I've never got over my surprise that I should have been born in the most estimable place in all the world." I can't tell you how many times that quote is used in town brochures and town reports and articles about the town. And I joke, I always use the Narcissus image because people sometimes ask me, describe Concord. And I said, sometimes I think we're Narcissus. We're so busy looking at our own reflection, we can't think about how we want to like go into the become part of the 21st century. And why I think this is a myth is because Concord has not stayed the same since 1850. We are not, a good friend of mine says, if Henry David Thoreau came walking to town right now, he wouldn't know where he was. He wouldn't be able to find his way. It's not the same place. We tend to forget, like these images right here. We were, and by the 20th century, Concord was progressing like a town in Massachusetts. We had trolley cars running down the street. We had electric poles, and we were fascinated by electricity. We had neon signs. We got Minutemen, but we still have neon signs at the luncheonette. We were like progressing and moving along as all towns were in the 20th century. And we had lots of people coming in. We had our town population grew, I believe, almost 300% between the end of the post-Civil War and like the early part of the 20th century. We had Italian immigrants and their fruit carts traversing the street. We had Korean and Chinese people opening businesses in both sides of town. Concord was a moving, diverse community in what the 20th century was starting to look like. We had one of the most famous Chinese American veterans, this man named Benjamin Ralph Chiemlau. I just only recently learned because of the Chinese community in Concord that he was born here. And what's so interesting about Chiemlau? Chiemlau, as a young aviator, sacrifices himself during World War II. And his father by that time was living in Chinatown in New York City. And in the 60s, the very first monument to any Chinese American soldier veteran is built in Chinatown for Ralph Chiemlau. He's born in Concord, but we don't recognize him. He's not on the World War II memorial. So that's another example of how we were becoming something, and we're trying to like call back and remember and become who we want to be in the 21st century. Sorry, I just want to. And I think in general in the 20th century, what were our biggest struggles? I think if you know anything about Metro West, you know it's not just true in Concord, the restrictive zoning that went in, whether you've read the book Don't Blame Us or you looked at the report by Boston Indicators and Exclusionary Design, lots of these leafy suburbs did a lot of restrictive zoning to keep out apartments, to keep out multifamily housing, and that was sort of a system of informal redlining. There's no red line maps for Concord and Lincoln and some of these western suburbs, but the work was still going on. It was just done in a different way. The well-meaning historic preservation movement of the 1950s and 1960s did a lot of good to save structures, but it also has hampered us in growing into the vibrant community we could be. the creation of Minuteman National Park. 1959, the authorization of Minuteman National Park seemed like a really good thing to do. But just to remind folks, I'm going to advance the slide. In 1959, with the creation of Minuteman National Park, the the Park Service chose to carve the park out of an area of the towns of Concord uh, and Lincoln. And to do so, they took over 200 homes and businesses were moved or demolished over 400 acres. A couple of things people were could sell willingly, or they were often pressured through fear of eminent domain. And it was a multi-year process to remove over 200 homes and businesses. If you look back and you look back to what Lincoln and Concord in this part was in the 20th century, there were restaurants, there were stores, there were ice cream shops, there were motels, there were businesses, there were farms, there were farm stands, there were people. And you kind of wonder what are people in 50 years, 100 years going to look back at us and wonder, what did we do with all this? Were their lives and their livelihoods any less important than having a 400-acre park? Perhaps, I don't know, but I know having lived in that space and knowing the people who were impacted, we sort of like disappeared those people. Um, I mean, it's something that Concord, it's a story that Concord needs to tell and Concord needs to think about. The current way the national park system does parks is really quite different than these huge battlefield parks that were created by Ford. But next time you go down 2A, anytime you see a vacant field with little fence, that was somebody's home or somebody's business or somebody's farm that used to be there. And I think this could have been places for people to live. We could, when we say we don't have enough housing now, this all could have been something quite different. But maybe what we needed to preserve. I was just at a national park um, out in California, and there were these white sheets over certain plants, and they were like buttoned to kind of like kill the plant. And I was asking, what are these for? Oh, those are not native plants, so we cover them up to kill them. And I always thought about back to all these homes and businesses, like we somehow decided in the 1950s that if it wasn't about 1775, it had to go. But those were people, and those were homes, and those are farms. And so, this open land acquisition, this happened in a lot of towns. Like, hey, let's buy up all the land so that people don't build homes. And for at least in Concord, that's created us as a racially isolated community. Concord is the only of all the surrounding towns is the only town that's lost a Black population between the 2010 and 2020 census. We're not going to thrive unless we change some of these. So just as to wrap up here, so we go to questions. I often show this picture. I feel like sometimes we've gotten trapped in like 1964 or 1965, like this greetings from Concord. Like we can't make that leap, which I think we're starting to do. So quickly, what have we learned? Is there anything we can apply to work in other places? I would say one of the things what has been helpful for us is to create a sense of urgency for the work, to come up with some very specific facts that people can understand. We have three signs: they're offending people and they're causing a lie, or we've never named a building after someone of color in 400 years, or right, some very specific facts that people can understand, and then to build a guiding coalition. And if you know, this is all changed work from Cotter. Guiding Coalition is a random group of people that are not very formal and they cross boundaries. So it's not just the Historic Commission. It's someone from the Historic Commission meeting with someone from the library, meeting with someone from the Council of Aging who knows some stories, with a friend who runs the cemetery, and someone who works in town government. It's getting all these people together and connecting and finding a very kind of motley mix makes a good guiding coalition, I think. Developing a focus, some concrete things you want to get done. We're going to get the name of the enslaver off the building. We're going to take 3 offensive signs down. We're going to put 2 good ones up. And we're going to get the school changed, like very specific things. And then you focus on those things relentlessly. Because if people try to present, oh, we're going to do a 5-year strategic plan to figure out how we're going to rethink, by the time you get that plan done, It's going to be time to write another one. Get to specific tasks and focus on them. Be willing to change obstacles to implementation because there's going to be obstacles. You're onto something if people are discussing. And I remember when the first sort of nastygrams started coming in the paper about the signs, people were worried. And we've talked about that's a good thing. That means we're talking about it. We're not going to get any better unless we have these conversations. It's like a family. If a family doesn't want to talk about the issue, right? We all know that in our personal lives. You don't talk about stuff, it's not going to get better. So if the community wants to get stronger, it needs to talk about these issues and work on them. Create short-term wins. This is long-term work. If people don't see short-term wins, they're not going to stay for the long-term work. You can't tell people we're going to get this fixed in 50 years. You have to say it's going to take a while, but here are 3 things we're going to get done this year. And then most importantly, anchor the changes into the community culture. Make sure that we're finding ways to make these stick so that 3, 5, 10 years from now, they're happening. And I think we've had a lot of success in getting it in the community culture in the last few years. Working together, all of us have been able to name a school after Ellen Garrison. We're starting to tell queer history. We had a Concord Pride for the first time. We're starting to tell the stories of queer people in Concord that haven't been told before. That's our Juneteenth celebration in the middle. We've raised the Juneteenth flag and had 2 Juneteenth celebrations. That's now becoming a Concord tradition. The middle section, there's a Tufts University, a collaboration. Then they made a beautiful documentary about Ellen Garrison. The bottom, that's the umbrella. They did a particular play called The Minutes, if you've never seen, that deals with retelling stories of towns. They presented that play this year. They involved us in it. Upper right, the 250 for the state of Massachusetts. Concord was one of 187 applications for these grants. Concord was one of 37 that received one, and ours was particularly funded because it's all going to be about Patriots of color. And we're honored that the governor honored the town with that work. So we're just really trying to do the work with lots of people to move it to a better place, because we really feel the 21st century of Concord is going to be something we haven't seen before. And then just to end, I always like to think about when people get upset or people wonder why are we doing this or why are we talking about this or why can't we just leave it alone, that the only people who think representation is not that important usually have always been represented. So part of our job is to try to speak up for those who haven't been represented. So I'm sorry, I'm about 3 minutes over. I hope I was able to just give you some ideas. We're not perfect. We don't know everything we're doing. I'm sure we're making mistakes, but we're doing the best we can to try to take these myths and these monuments and these memories and create something new. So I'll be quiet and take some questions.
Thanks very much, Joe, for what really was a thought-provoking presentation, because you're not just saying, here's some historical sort of facts, but looking at how history has been examined and presented and who's been presenting it through time. And indeed, there's been a pretty robust conversation, partly in chat and partly actually to the hosts and panelists, because it's a little bit hard in the chat, in the format we have, to always get it going to the group as a whole. But I want to sort of highlight some of the comments, and then we'll go into questions, and then we'll also go into examining just, how fair is it to criticize the way history was done in the past. We won't get to that yet, but I do want to bring that up. One person was saying, gosh, this history that you're describing, so many similar things to Medford, Massachusetts, actually next town over to where I live in Malden. So many similar things to Medford's founding narratives. Others saying, especially as you brought up how the national park was created, and I didn't know any of that history. Springfield, where the Eastern States Fairgrounds are, huge swath of fairgrounds out in Springfield in Western Mass, looks like old Concord. Another person saying, oh, Buttricks brings back memories. Another person saying,
hey, Buttricks.
Yeah, it brings back memories to you too. My dad worked on a tractor on a farm in Lexington in the 1930s. I grew up on a Gold Star Road in Lexington, same house as my dad. So what you're doing is really evoking memories, evoking also our wrestling with how do we remember and want to remember, and how do we change what we're wanting to remember about the past of our own towns with it. Let me go to some of the questions that we've got in the Q&A, folks. First question was, Anglicans have been written out of New England's history. Is there any effort that you know of to bring the Anglicans back into New England history? Not only the Anglican families in southern Maine, which by the way used to be part of Massachusetts, but that really the Anglicans, such as lawyer Thomas Morton, their settlements were essentially destroyed in some ways by the Puritan Mass Bay Puritan colony. Any knowledge on Anglican?
No,
No.
I would say I couldn't give a good answer other than saying if those are people that you feel whose stories are not being told, then that's the work you want to do, is get that information out there and start putting it in bite-sized pieces that people can understand and fight for it.
Yeah, that's a really good piece of advice. Another person says, what's interesting about the removals that created the park? This is the Minuteman National Park, which those of us around the area are very familiar with. What percentage of the buildings or homes were owned by people of color? Do you know that were destroyed?
That's a really good question. I'm sure the data's there, and I think that because the park did a beautiful job at memorializing everything that was taken down or taken, that there's photos of everything, and I'm sure there's good detail. That would be some excellent research someone should do. I do think in the next 50 years, people are going to be asking, what happened to those people in those houses? And if it would be nice if we started working on that sooner rather than later.
Yes. Another person put into the question Q&A, and folks, put your questions in there. Regarding people of color and their role in abolition, are you familiar with the Grimke's, Carrie Greenidge's book, The Grimke's, The Legacy of
Yes.
Slavery in an American Family?
It's a
We hear
wonderful
about
book.
the white Grimke sisters.
Right.
Greenidge highlights the black Grimke's. It's important history.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a wonderful book, and it's so she came to speak in town, and it's such a dovetail. Like, it's just I think the need to always like look behind whatever someone's telling you. What's the behind to this? Because we do the best we can telling the history at the time in which we live, and anything we do now to make it better. 50 years from now, someone's going to look back and look at all our mistakes. Good. That's what we want to do. It's called like, growth and development. So I think that when we think about we're not criticizing how it was done. We're acknowledging something was done kind of funky. Let's fix it.
Yeah. And another person says, and I'll try, folks, by the way, to put the Grimke's quote in the chat or the book in the chat if I get a chance. Thanks for the presentation. Could you say more about contacts with or efforts to develop relationships with the Nipmuc indigenous people living nearby? Have they been consulted about their representation?
Yeah, I think that to do it properly, there really should be an outreach from like level. So the town of Concord at the highest level needs to approach the Nipmuc Tribal Council at the highest level to begin the conversation. That part's not happened yet. What's happened is individual organizations like the Concord Museum has built relationships with specific people. The Umbrella Art Center has developed specific relationships, which I think is good. But I think for the town itself, we really need to come to make a formal approach so that that relation has formal levels of authority. Uh, the, that's my opinion and what I've been taught, but I'm not an expert. But that's what I think needs to at least need to start there. The good thing is Concord's going to be doing, 1630, 1635, 2030, 2035. All that's going to be coming up. It's going to try to celebrate itself. We're going to be forced to have to build relationship with our indigenous neighbors if we want to do it accurately in the 21st century.
And we've got a good challenging question here. Joe, throughout your talk, you consistently used the word we. Who
Mhm.
is we?
Lots of people at museums, other interpreters in town, citizens that care about this, members of a historical commission, members of town government, um, all kind of folks. That's what the whole part of a guiding coalition. It's not like a formal, organized group. It's people come together on different things. Like people come together on the signs, or they come together on this naming the school, or they come together and want to talk about the national park. So it's sort of an amorphous group of people who just are trying to figure out how to do this work. It's not an organized. So unfortunately, you can't go to an organization, but if you want to get some really good history, you can always come to the Robbins House because we're the spot for Concord's Black history.
And another person said, have you read Enslavement in the Puritan Village, The Untold History of Sudbury and Wayland, Massachusetts, that was recently
No,
released?
I was talking to my friend Richard. He said he was getting his copy last week, and he said he was looking forward to seeing it. And I think there's going to be a presentation on it.
Yes. So is this
Yeah.
Jane Scasha,
Yeah,
who works at, person says, worked
yeah.
at National Park and the Homes and at the bridge?
I just heard the
Jane
book
is
is
going to
great
be
too.
speaking in March
Mhm.
with partnership on one of these Zooms about
There's a,
enslavement in a Puritan village. So that's
because there's one just came out by Don Hafner about Lincoln. I mean, no, you can't stop this, right? It's the 21st century. We're going to start telling these stories. So these books are coming out. This interpretations are going to happen. The change is going to happen. The question is, are we going to embrace it and make it exciting and wonderful, or are we going to try to fight it and pretend like it's 1957?
yeah. And another person, by the way, saying, I can't see the chat and the questions you're referring to. That should be at, sorry about that. That should be at the bottom or top of your screen. Under Q&A is where you can type in questions, and there should be another command that says chat, which is a webinar chat. Most of those chats go to host and panelists, but you can switch it to everyone there. Another person says, hey, don't forget to mention that Ellen Garrison is buried in Altadena. Is that
Yeah,
Altadena, California?
I like to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
That's a classic to me, a really important example. When the folks at the Robbins House started researching more about Ellen, we knew her life in Boston, we knew her life in the South, and then we sort of lost track of her. We didn't lose track of her. Last time we found her was in Kansas. Um, and she was working, the Exodusters was a group of Black Americans who were trying to make their way and create new communities. She went out with them in the 1870s-ish, I think, if I have it right. One of the members of the Robbins House interpretive staff went out there and just sorted through, like you have to do as a good historian, mortgage paper, and got into the Cower House and found that when Ellen Garrison and her husband sold their property in Kansas, they signed it from Pasadena, Altadena. And that was the first time we had any clue. We got the research done. We connected with folks in Pasadena. We have a wonderful relationship with the Altadena Historical Society. And they, through their work, discovered Ellen Garrison's unmarked resting place. And so in the last 5 years, the Altadena Historic Society has found and marked Ellen Garrison's gravesite, her sister's gravesite, her husband's gravesite. And we've just started to develop a wonderful relationship between their honoring Ellen, their daughter, in their community, and our honoring Ellen in our community. Unfortunately, with the fires that have just torn through Los Angeles, Altadena was terribly affected. The fascinating story is the fire as it approached the cemetery itself, and the cemetery went around it, and the cemetery ended up blocking a whole section of the city because of how it had been tended appropriately. It actually saved a portion of Altadena. There's a lot of work they have to do there, and this Sunday, the president of the Altadena Historic Society is coming to Concord, and with the Robbins House, we're doing a joint fundraiser for them because of our relationship with them. And I can certainly let you have more information. But yeah, we have a wonderful connection with Altadena, and it's just amazing that the granddaughter of an enslaved man in her lifetime is able to do that work and ends up, in Pasadena, Altadena. I mean, this is 1860, 1670. She goes there. The train track is just being laid when she goes out there. But that's to me the power of the beauty of the country, that we've been doing nothing in the last 250 years but expanding human freedom, and we're not going to stop. We're not going to.
Jill, by the way, send me that information. I'll put it up on Partnership's Facebook page, if nothing else. We
Yeah.
do have a question that I'm actually going to also read something that was put up in the chat about, can you illuminate on who authorized the removal of the 1930 tercentenary signs in Concord? Did the town council weigh in? Did the select board? I actually want to read a chat comment by Nancy Priscilla Lee, saying that Nancy wrote the comprehensive report about the three markers. When there was a visitor complaint about the Jethro tree marker, Nancy had been researching the 1930 tercentenary marker project, the meaning of the three markers. This was a long process that deserved, in her opinion, responsible detailed research so that taking the markers down could be properly explained to Concordians. Unfortunately, some people wanted the signs taken down quickly, and that resulted in a lot of controversy. Yeah, the oval sign above the Brister Hill Road sign is incorrect, as Joe is pointing out. The Historical Commission intends to make a recommendation about this sign too. So,
So Nancy was fundamental in the work of getting this started. The exhaustive research she did on that project, she didn't just investigate those three signs, she investigated every marker in the town. And then it just accelerated. We were going at sort of normal, I'd say, town municipal speed. And then with the complaint, it accelerated. Back to the other question about who had the ultimate authorization. In this sense, these were all public right of way. So the select board authorized their removal for maintenance, and the town manager was executed on that as the executive officer of the town, and they were removed and they're stored safely on town property. I think the hope is someday they're placed in some particular interpretive setting because they are historical objects and they should be described and taught about. But that part's not been organized yet. I don't know if I answered the question accurately. I mean, fully, but if there's more, let me know.
yeah, it sounds it's an ongoing part of how history is being interpreted in Concord, and indeed part of Concord's history. All of this is part of Concord history. I do want to bring up a comment that was sent to hosts and panelists, a person who was upset about essentially you're inserting contemporary opinion into the way history was being interpreted and how people were celebrating things in the 1920s and 30s, black-faced, etc. Can you discuss your thoughts on history and being impartial as a historian?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I think that the thing that's always important to have people know is that we didn't do it. We weren't there. We're not responsible that it happened. We are responsible for knowing and understanding. And if it impacts things today, I think that's where our responsibility lies. So to me, if we have a book that has blackface and red face in a public setting and we're selling that book, we have a responsibility to speak up and say that's not acceptable. That needs to happen. If we have tell the story of two queer women who opened the Concord Art Museum, Concord Art Association, and we don't want to talk about that, someone needs to say that's not okay, because that's not who we are if we really want to include and represent everyone. So I would not say that my work is an impartial historian. I'm a historical interpreter, and my job is to help tell authentic stories that are based on fact and supported with evidence, but are helpful and indicative of what we want to become in the 21st century. I want to live in a community and in a world where it's open and you're welcome and people want to live here and feel seen. Right now, if you go into the center of our town, there is not one monument, picture, visual. There is no public place in the entire community where you can see a person of color represented. Zero. You can pay to go into the Concord Museum and you'll see some good stuff. But you can't any random place you would go, the post office, the library, the townhouse. So that's like, people need to talk about that. We need to do something about that. Why is it that we are losing people of color? Why are they not moving here? Right? That's this work that needs to be done. And it's tough. It's a hard conversation. I mean, I often feel like we have you know how in a family you don't want to talk about stuff? You're like, I do have to ruin the holidays and bring that up. Can't we just have a nice time? I think sometimes we fall into that as a community. Like, why do we have to talk about? Can't we just have a good time and make it nice? I think it's also, I go back to that Narcissus picture I use a lot. It reminds me of, if you have I always think of a community like a personal friend. Like if you have a friend or coworker or a family member that all they talk about is how awesome they are all the time and how they do everything right and in the most perfect place ever. After a while, you're like, oh my God, I don't want to hang around him anymore. I don't want to have them over for dinner because they're only talk about how awful they are, how wonderful they are. Why would a community want to be that? Why do we always have to brag all the time? Why don't we talk about the wonderful things we've done and the things we didn't do so well and that we're learning about it and we're making something new? To me, that's the kind of person I want to hang around. That's the kind of community I want to live in.
And indeed, we're getting a bit in the chat. We're getting some interesting comments actually that are unfortunately most partly going to host and panelists. One person saying, I remember people who were sad to see the signs go because it was, quote, erasing our history. It would indeed be nice to see those signs displayed where there can be a discussion of this and the controversy. Another person chiming in with, yeah, you know, first impressions of a local space matter. I have to admit, when I was in Concord, in the middle of the fall, yeah, I was just sort of seeing the gosh, aren't we lovely, the birthplace of, you know, a free society sort of thing. Um, so we're getting a really interesting
We did, and
conversation going on
we
here.
did cool stuff, but we didn't do it alone.
Yeah.
And why can't we like
Yeah.
embrace everyone? We're not taking away, we're adding.
Yeah. So let's end the questions with a person who's in the Historical Society of Watertown. And I'm thinking also of the person early on in the chat who said, hey, this really reminds me of Medford. And I'm thinking of myself in Malden. Person asks, is there a central resource hub where we can go for stuff? How do we really build this? Build this as ourselves in our own communities? How can we expand the stories in our own communities? And where can we go to get help with that? Any idea?
Well, I think where to start is, which I'm sure you've already thought of, is just find a few key stories that you want to tell or identify a couple of things that aren't right and should be changed and just focus on a few key things. And I think that what was most helpful for us, we started to talk to other places. I drove out to Sheffield that one summer when they were putting up the Mum Bet statue, uh, or Elizabeth Freeman statue, more accurately described, and talk to them about what advice do you have? If you can do this way out here in this little town, what did it? And then Little Compton, Rhode Island had done a bunch of work about telling their story of enslavement, or the folks that put in the stepping stones in Connecticut. Find people who've done it and just have them like info dump on you. That was what was most helpful to us. And that's when they taught us pick a few things, go after them relentlessly, and tell people the honest story, because most people in your community want things to be better once they understand there's new information. I think most people don't know about how the park was created, or don't know that Concord abolitionist was led by women and people of color, or so I think it's a few things, and hit them relentlessly and then start talking to everybody about it. I think the old thing that I was taught a long time ago is, you know, you're communicating something enough when people know what you're going to say before it comes out of your mouth. They go, oh God, they're going to say X again. That's how you know you're communicating enough in your town. People, oh, here they come. They're going to tell me about Black history again. When people start telling you that, you know you're onto something, I think.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yep.
Oh,
And
Atlantic Black Box, somebody mentioned, yes. Patriots for Stark Boston, Atlantic Black Box. There's lots of people who are source for some of this stuff. Sorry.
no, that's great. And also I was thinking a resource sorry, I'm also typing that I'm about to put into the chat. There we go. Just sort of explaining who Mum Bet or Elizabeth
Yeah,
Freeman
Elizabeth
is.
Friedman, sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm a teacher also, so I'm like doing doing
I mean,
expansions in places.
in Northampton has stuff going on. I mean, many parts of the state are doing awesome things. And I think sometimes for some communities showcasing, like saying in Concord, like Arlington was able to put into a monument to the unknown enslaved. How come we can't do that? Lexington just put in a monument to women's history. How come we can't do that? Sometimes people need to be compared to other places to get them, and to let benchmarking sometimes gets people off their laurels. We are not perfect. We can do better.
And that question about a central resource hub, um, there is the Mass History Alliance, which is essentially an alliance coalition of historical societies in Massachusetts and historical organizations. The partnership is a member of that coalition. It's no dues, although frankly they can use donations just like Partnership of Historic Boston's really needs donations to keep on going. And they do a conference, a Massachusetts History Conference, generally the first Monday in June. And I know that's coming up. They're doing one again this year. And that may be a place for people to go to. And indeed, Joe, it would be kind of fun to do a workshop there, you know? I'm suddenly thinking on that. That would be potentially really useful. So with that, let's wrap up your marvelous presentation. Thanks for really an awful lot to think on, not only about the history of Concord, but really about how we look at history, how we can expand the stories that are told. And it gets me wondering, how are people going to look at the history that I'm telling now, 50 years later? It's going to be kind of interesting. So with that, let's wrap this up. Our next, this was Signed Stories and Unraveling Myths by Joe Palumbo. And next month, the Partnership of Historic Bostons will be having David Hall talk on Zoom about wonders, portents, and providences. And David will be exploring the very different mental world of the 17th century, something that I'm incredibly interested in. I actually hope eventually to do a novel set in the 17th century and understanding how people viewed their world that is probably very different from the assumptions I have about how the world should be viewed will be really good. And as we were mentioning, in March, on Wednesday, March 26th, local historian Jane Scascio will be talking about enslavement in a Puritan village. And that talk will actually be moderated by one of the partnership's advisors, Reverend Stephanie May, who is the minister of First Church Boston, the first parish, first church established in Boston by those Puritan Massachusetts Bay settlers. So those are several of the things we have coming up. And we will be soon also posting 2 presentations on the revolution before the American Revolution, which will be historian Frank Bremer, actually another of our advisors, and Adrian Weimer, who is a noted historian also. So thank you so much for attending. As I mentioned, the partnership, we can't do this without you, not just having you as an audience, but because the partnership is an all-volunteer organization. We don't have income or staff. We do this through donations. We do this through ourselves, and perhaps you too would like to join us in bringing history to people, making history come alive, expanding those stories. So if you'd like to donate, we'd be delighted in a donation. If you'd like to become active in the partnership, we'll be reaching out to folks in a while about some projects that you can join us in doing. And let's just bring history alive to everyone, and let's bring everyone's history alive. With that, thank you so much, Joe. Thank you so much, everyone who came tonight. And I look forward to exploring more of the past and, frankly, our present and how we look at the past with you together in the future, too.